Exchange of the respiratory gases. The gas exchange occurs across the pulmonary membrane by the process called as diffusion. The rate of diffusion is dependent on the following factors. As you can see over here, the first one is the partial pressure of gases on either side of the membrane, and the second one is the surface area available for the diffusion. And what are the partial pressure of gases? In accordance with the Dalton's law, the partial pressure exerted by a gas in a mixture of non-reacting gases is proportional to the fractional concentration of that gas. By this formula, Px is equal to Pb into F, where Px is the partial pressure of the gas, which is expressed in millimeters of mercury, and Pb is the barometric pressure, and F is the fractional concentration of the gas. So if you see here, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere at the sea level with the fractional concentration of 21% can be calculated by using this formula. We know what is the formula, which is Px is equal to Pb into F. So here the partial pressure of oxygen is equal to 760 millimeters of mercury into 0.21, which is 160 mm of Hg, where the barometric pressure Pb at the sea level is 760 mm of Hg, and the partial pressure of oxygen in humidified tracheal air can be calculated by the so and so formula, where we have to remove the pressure of the water vapor or the partial pressure of water from the barometric air pressures over here. So the partial pressure of oxygen is equal to 760 minus 47 into 0.21, which is equal to 150 mm of Hg. So the difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere and the partial pressure of oxygen in the humidified tracheal air, the difference is 10 millimeters of mercury. That's mainly because of the difference in the water vapor pressure. And next is in the addition of water vapor. That's what I'm explaining you over here. The addition of water vapor decreases the percentage concentration of oxygen in the alveolar air, which leads to decrease in the partial pressure from 160 to 150. So the dilution of the partial pressure by the water vapor is very important at high altitudes where the atmospheric oxygen tension is already low. Example, if you see over here, if a mountain climber is exposed to an atmospheric pressure of 460 millimeters of mercury at a high altitude, what will be the partial pressure of alveolar oxygen in this person? Let us assume that the fractional concentration of oxygen is still 21% and the atmospheric pressure is 460 millimeters of mercury, where partial pressure of arterial oxygen can be calculated as Pb minus partial pressure of water into F, according to our formula 460 minus 47 into 0.21 is 86.7 millimeters of mercury. So here the value what we got, 86.7 millimeters of mercury, is less than the partial pressure of alveolar oxygen of 97 millimeters of mercury that would be expected in the absence of dilution of inspired air with the water vapor, right? So this is what you need to know about this. And next is, what is the diffusion? Diffusion rate of oxygen across the pulmonary membrane depends on the following factors. The first one is the pressure gradient. The pressure gradient can be abbreviated as P over here. The pressure gradient between the oxygen within the pulmonary capillaries and the alveolar oxygen. So the gradient which is present between the pulmonary capillary and the alveolar oxygen will decide or determine the diffusion capacity of this particular gas. And the second one over here is the surface area. So the surface area across the pulmonary membrane or the pulmonary capillary membrane is the second deciding factor, and The third one is the diffusion distance, which can be calculated as T across the oxygen must diffuse through this membrane. So all the three important factors are responsible for the diffusion of the gases. These variables are expressed in Fick's law of diffusion, where the solubility coefficient for the oxygen, that is S, is unchanging constant. So the rate of diffusion is a part of proportional to the concentration gradient of oxygen across the pulmonary membrane. By using this formula, D is equal to P into A into S divided by T. So what is the pathophysiology behind this? Oxygen diffusion can be impaired by any process that decreases oxygen pressure. Example is high altitude, and also decreased surface area of the pulmonary membrane like we see in the emphysema, or increased diffusion distance like in the pulmonary fibrosis. Any of these conditions can decrease the diffusing capacity of the oxygen. So now let us see what is the diffusing capacity of the pulmonary membrane over here. It is described as the volume of gas that can diffuse across the pulmonary membrane in 1 minute when the pressure differences across the membrane is 1 millimeters of mercury. It is usually measured by using carbon monoxide as an example. So the diffusing capacity of the lungs is normally so great that the oxygen exchange is perfusion limited, which means that the amount of oxygen that enters the arterial circulation is only limited by the amount of blood flow to the lungs, or we can say the cardiac output. In certain type of lung diseases, the diffusion capacity may be reduced to such an extent that oxygen exchange becomes diffusion limited. So what is the pathophysiology note over here? So the following pathophysiologic mechanisms reduces the diffusing capacity of the gas, that is oxygen. One is the restrictive diseases where there is an increased thickness of the pulmonary membrane. Example, if you see silicosis or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And the second one, where it is the decrease in the surface area available for the gaseous exchange, as we can see in the collapse of the alveoli, atelectasis, or any of the lung segments. And the third important factor is a poor lung compliance, which is causing insufficient ventilation, which is typically seen in the condition like silicosis. And the fourth important point, where there is a destruction of the alveolar units, that also leads to decreased surface area, that is seen in the conditions like emphysema. All these are the important factors to understand this mechanism. And next is, what is the perfusion limited and the diffusion limited gas exchange? The first one is the perfusion limited gas exchange. Gas equilibrates early along the length of the pulmonary capillary, such as the partial pressure of the gas in the pulmonary capillary equal to that of the alveolar air, what you can see over here. Only if the blood flow increases can the diffusion of the gas can be increased, which is called as perfusion limited exchange. And next is, what is the diffusion limited exchange? By the time the gas reaches the end of the pulmonary capillary, the gas does not equilibrate, where the partial pressure difference of the gas between the alveolar air and the arterial blood is maintained. As long as the partial pressure gradient exists, the diffusion continues. So here, the diffusion limited exchange can occur with oxygen in abnormal conditions like exercising with interstitial lung disease, or healthy people who exercise vigorously at high altitudes. So this is what is very important for you to note, and this is the image shows the diffusion of the carbon monoxide across the pulmonary membrane, which is diffusion limited. So by this we completed the diffusion limited and the perfusion limited gas exchange. Now let us concentrate by seeing these three graphs. So all the three graphs describe the characteristics of gas exchange between the alveolus and the pulmonary blood. The first graph shows normal oxygen uptake, and the second graph, if you see over here, it shows the diffusion limited exchange where the carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin with a very high affinity. So alveolar partial pressure of carbon monoxide and blood partial pressure of carbon monoxide never equilibrate. And third one is perfusion limited exchange. Here if you see the example, if you see this graph, hemoglobin does not bind to nitrogen, so equilibration occurs rapidly. This is what is about examples of the limited gas exchange by means of these three graphs.